LA Theatre Works presents the world premiere of The Tug of War, written by David Rambo, directed by Brian Kite, starring Matthew Arkin, Hugo Armstrong, Seamus Dever, Matthew Floyd Miller, James Morrison, David Selby, Rich Sommer, Josh Stamberg, Nick Torrin, John Vickery, and Jules Wilcox. In this original commission for LA Theatre Works, the judgment of an untested president is all that stands between us and World War III. As Soviet nuclear missiles are discovered in Cuba, President John F. Kennedy must chart a course between conflicting counsel and unparalleled emotional stakes to prevent nuclear annihilation. The play is based on recently declassified documents and taped conversations among Kennedy's trusted advisors. And now, The Tug of War, produced by LA Theatre Works.
Sons of bitches lied.
Tuesday morning, October 16th. The Oval Office.
Khrushchev, Dobrynin, Gromyko.
All their denials that the weapons weren't...
Well, they are nuclear weapons.
Shit.
Offensive weapons. Medium-range ballistic missiles. You can see in the U-2 photography the storage areas, the launches.
90 miles off our coastline.
Latest photos were taken 2 days ago, Sunday morning. Same time, we had Mac Bundy all over TV assuring everybody that any Soviet assistance down there was solely for Cuba's defense.
As the Russians were claiming in all their public statements and in the Security Council, and our own intelligence confirmed.
Our own intelligence was mistaken.
Shit. 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 Shit.
It's this hawkish campaign rhetoric the Republicans have been spouting that probably drove Castro right to Khrushchev's door. God damn it. Khrushchev gave me his word he wouldn't do anything to embarrass me before the midterm.
Oh, he lied.
Sure as hell did.
Now, people need to be reminded that the Bay of Pigs was an Eisenhower mission.
No, he had doubts about it too. I'm the one who signed off on it. I'm the one who took the CIA's word and the chief's that if we trained those exiles and got them back to Cuba, the resistance would be waiting for them and Castro would be gone. Checkmate. Christ, now it sounds...
Only because it failed.
Naive. And 100 good men are dead. 1,200 more in prison. Hell, if I were Castro, I'd want Khrushchev's missiles in my mountains now, too.
What are you going to do?
Going to put Caroline on a pony. Wally Shiraz bringing his family over to see the White House. Caroline loves the astronauts. Wants to show him a pony. So I'm going to put her on it and watch her ride. We're going to stick to our schedules and not raise any suspicions. We are not going to cause panic. Cannot have another Bay of Pigs. We're going to look at the situation from all sides and hash out every option, strengths and weaknesses, and every possible outcome before I make any decisions.
Excuse me, Mr. President. Captain Shiraz approaching the south entrance.
Thank you, Mrs. Lincoln. I'll be right there. I have Mac Bundy convening a National Security Committee. The cover is we're reviewing the defense budget. So tell your office you're working here all day on that. I'll join everyone in the cabinet room soon as Caroline's out of the saddle. And Bobby?
Yeah?
If you haven't said your morning prayers yet, now would be a good time.
Tuesday, October 16th, the cabinet room. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor.
Morning, Mac.
Bobby.
Who else is coming?
John McCone, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I had the U-2 photos blown up so everyone can see.
What in the hell are we looking at there? Chicken coops?
No, Mr. Vice President, those are missile trailers.
They look like chicken coops. Lyndon Johnson, Vice President of the United States.
Dean Rusk, Secretary of State.
Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense.
General Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Good to have you here, Tommy.
A pleasure. Llewellyn Thompson, former ambassador to the Soviet Union.
Ted Sorensen, Special Advisor to the President. There are 14 of us here, all told. The Treasury Secretary, Mr. Dillon, and George Ball, Undersecretary of State, a very wise fellow. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Paul Nitze, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security. And, of course, the advisor the President trusts more than anyone else in the room.
Robert Kennedy, Attorney General of the United States.
Over the last months, we confirmed shipments of Soviet Il-28 bombers to Cuba, which, because their design is so nearly obsolete, we concluded were for defensive purposes. Our intelligence now confirms that there are MiG-21 aircraft on the airfields down there as well, which can transport nuclear bombs. These are of greater concern now with this photography taken Sunday morning. This photo shows a medium-range ballistic launch site and 2 new military encampments near San Cristobal, south of Havana. You're looking at 14 canvas-covered missile trailers, missile erector launchers, vehicles, buildings, and 1 building under construction.
How do you know that's a medium-range ballistic missile?
The length. We compared it with data on missiles dragged through the streets in the Moscow parade and estimate this has a range of 1,100 miles.
As far as Washington.
Or St. Louis, Little Rock, Austin. And with the megaton yield, it could impact New York, Chicago.
John, is this missile ready to be fired?
No, sir.
How long before it can be fired?
That depends on the ground support for the missile, Mr. McNamara.
John, would you care to comment on the position of the nuclear warheads?
We can find nothing that would spell nuclear warheads in terms of any isolated area or unique security.
This is not fenced, I believe, at the moment.
No.
This is important as it relates to whether these today are ready to fire, Mr. President. It seems almost impossible to me that they would be ready to fire with nuclear warheads on a site without even a fence around.
We do not believe they are ready to fire.
However, there's no feeling that they can't fire from this kind of position, is there? It's not a question of waiting for extensive concrete pads and that sort of thing.
That's correct, General.
One thing I'd point out,
Mr. Bundy?
Because of the tropical weather conditions, there's always cloud cover somewhere. We can't claim to have photographs of the whole island, so I think one of the first questions
Authorize more flights.
Mr. President.
Mr. Rusk.
Obviously, we're looking at what is a Soviet base, and I think we have to set in motion a chain of events that will eliminate that base. The thing that I'm, of course, very conscious of is that while we can't sit still, there is no such thing as unilateral action by the United States. Any action we take will greatly increase the risk to our alliances and other forces in other parts of the world. So I think we have to think very hard about 2 major courses of action as alternatives. One is the quick strike. Should we agree there is the overwhelming, overriding necessity to take all the risks that are involved in doing that. The other would be a combination of things. We ask the Organization of American States to make it quite clear that the entire hemisphere considers that the Rio Pact has been violated. We also alert our allies and Mr. Khrushchev that there is an utterly serious crisis in the making, that we could be facing a situation that could well lead to general war. We have an obligation to do what needs to be done, but I should think we want to do it in a way that gives everybody a chance to pull back before it gets too hard to do so.
Thank you, Secretary Rouse.
Mr. President.
Secretary McNamara.
There are 2 propositions I would suggest that we ought to accept as foundations for our further thinking. First, if we are to conduct an airstrike against these installations or any part of Cuba, we must now agree that we will schedule that prior to these installations becoming operational. Because if they become operational before the airstrike, I do not believe we can knock them out before they become launched. And if they become launched, there is almost certain to be chaos in parts of the East Coast or the area in a radius of up to 1,000 miles from Cuba. Secondly, I would submit the proposition that any airstrike must not be directed solely against the missile sites, but against the missile sites, plus the airfields, plus their aircraft, which may not be on the airfields, plus all the potential nuclear storage sites. Now, this is a fairly extensive airstrike, and there would be potential casualties of Cubans in at least the hundreds, more likely 2,000 or 3,000. However, we're prepared right now to carry out an airstrike within a matter of days. General Taylor.
Yes, even a couple of hours if it were absolutely essential.
Then the airstrike would be followed by an invasion, both by air and sea, approximately 7 days later. There would be some degree of mobilization involved, possibly requiring 5 days, depending on the invasion requirements. I think you may want to hear General Taylor outline this.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Practically, I think our knowledge of the timing of the readiness of these missiles is going to be so difficult that we'll never have an exact, perfect timing to take them all out. We hope to take out the vast majority in a first strike, but not just one strike, one day, rather a continuous air attack for whenever necessary, whenever we discover a new target.
I don't believe myself that the critical question is whether you get a particular missile before it goes off, because if they shoot those missiles, we are in general nuclear war.
Well, I would strongly emphasize that I think our planning should be based on the assumption that it is, Dean. We don't know what kinds of communication the Soviets have with those sites. We don't know what kinds of control they have over those warheads.
Why are they doing this? What's the advantage?
What Mr. Khrushchev may have in mind is that he knows we have a substantial nuclear superiority. He also knows that we don't really live under fear of his nuclear weapons to the extent that he has to live under fear of ours. Our nuclear weapons near him, in Turkey, for instance.
How many weapons do we have in Turkey?
We have the Jupiter missiles.
About 15, I believe, to be the figure.
I think that's the right number.
Khrushchev may also feel it's important for us to learn about living under medium-range missiles, too.
Well, we have evidence that Khrushchev honestly believes, or affects to believe, that we have nuclear weapons in Japan.
I think also that the Berlin situation is very much part of this. More of his wall is going up over there every day.
At the Vienna summit, he was clearly obsessed with Berlin.
Yes, he calls it the testicles of the West. Whenever he wants to make us holler, he just gives Berlin a good squeeze.
He may be thinking he can bargain Berlin and Cuba against each other.
If he's pushing it this far, he grossly misunderstands the importance of Cuba to this country.
Your thoughts, Mr. Vice President?
Well, the people are really concerned about this. In my opinion, the country's blood pressure is already up, and they're fearful, and they're insecure, and they're getting divided. I think we have to be prudent and cautious and talk to the commanders and see what they say. I'm not much for circularizing it over the hill or with our allies, even though I realize that's a breach of faith. We're not going to get much help out of them.
Now, there is an intermediate position. There are perhaps 2 or 3 of our principal allies or heads of government we could communicate with, at least on a 24-hour notice basis.
And we've got to try to stop the planes, stop the ships, stop the submarines, and everything else the Soviets are sending over there.
Stop them from coming in.
A blockade.
We are talking about 2 or 3 different potential operations. One is the strike just on these 3 missile bases. The second is the broader one that Secretary McNamara was talking about. Third is doing both those things and also, at the same time, launching a blockade.
Mr. President,
yes.
We have a fourth one, really, which is the invasion. But I would say if you're dropping bombs all over Cuba, you're going to kill an awful lot of people, and you're going to take an awful lot of heat on it. Now, you know the heat. And I think it's almost incumbent upon the Russians then to say, well, we're going to do the same thing to Turkey and anywhere else they believe we have missiles.
You know, how long does it take us to get into a position where we can invade Cuba? Almost a month? 2 months?
No, sir. It's a bare 7 days after the airstrike.
General, you could get 6 or 7 divisions into Cuba.
If we were to go in right away,
days.
we could put in 90,000 men in 11 days. If you give us some more time so we can get all the advanced preparation and pre-positioning, we'd put the same 90,000 there in 5 days.
You think 90,000 is enough?
Enough to get the thing started.
Well, there's a real possibility that if you carried out an airstrike, that might lead to an uprising such that in order to prevent the slaughter of the free Cubans, we would have to invade to reintroduce order to the country.
Well, now, what is it we have? What is it we want to do, need to do in the next 24 hours to prepare for any of these? We can't wait 2 weeks while we're getting ready to roll. Maybe we just have to take them out, continue our other preparations if we decide to do that. That may be where we end up. We're certainly going to do option number 1. We're certainly going to take out these missiles. Whether it would be a general airstrike, that we're not ready to say, but we should be in preparation for it. And then the question of an invasion. We ought to be making those preparations.
You want to be clear, Mr. President, whether we've definitely decided against a political track. I myself think we ought to work out a contingency on that.
We'll develop both tracks.
Good. Work on those, and let's meet again at
6 o'clock?
Yeah, 6. As much as possible. Stick to your regular schedules. Let's keep this tight.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
Mr.
Yes, sir.
President.
Mr. President, Mrs. Kennedy is in the Red Room with the Libyan Crown Prince and your other luncheon guests.
And then I'm free after lunch.
No, you're scheduled to...
Whatever it is, block out time for me to have a swim.
Jack's health is terrible even on a good day. Since he was a small boy, he's had constant stomach cramps, colitis, fevers, respiratory difficulties, back pain. And that he was even accepted for active duty in the United States Navy is a testament to his strong sense of purpose, his stamina, and his patriotism. And our father's Rolodex. Every day, he gets a dozen or more injections. Painkillers, steroids, vitamins. 8 years ago, doctors told him that surgery for his Addison's disease would probably kill him. He chose to go through with it anyway because he said either outcome would be better than continuing to live with the pain, which he still has, in spite of the operation. It's remarkable how he perseveres, even with a crisis like this going on. How he embraces the richness of life, his family, his appetites. He swims every day for his back, which gives him time alone to think with no distractions. He often asks me to come by. We can talk privately then while whatever he was thinking about in the water is still fresh in his mind.
Adlai Stevenson came to lunch.
Was he briefed on the situation?
He went pale when he saw the U-2 photos. But he doesn't think we should make an airstrike until we've explored every possibility of negotiating a peaceful solution.
And that's Adlai. If he had any balls, he'd be sitting in the Oval Office instead of the UN.
When Khrushchev was just beating the hell out of me in Vienna, he said I was too intelligent and too weak to ever go to war. I wonder if that's why he feels he can get away with this. That's why he's decided to stop playing God.
You know what I thought of when you said Adlai wants us to negotiate our way out of this?
Dad.
Yeah? And Munich.
Hitler showed him you can't negotiate peace with someone whose motivation is the very idea of war itself.
You think Khrushchev wants war?
I think he wants Berlin.
Well, you might get both.
Oh, Christ, if we lose Berlin. Did you read The Guns of August yet?
No.
I told you, you've got to read it.
Yeah, I know, I will. I've been reading Green Eggs and Ham every night. The boys won't go to sleep until they hear it.
Yeah, Caroline and John too, but read The Guns of August. It's brilliant. The way it makes you see how a small event in one place got connected to one in another country with interlocking treaties, and before you know it, we had World War I and 17 million people dead. Now, I want us to keep in mind what Dean Rusk said this morning, that whatever we decide to do, we should do it in a way that gives everybody a chance to pull back before it's too late. World War III must never happen.
That evening, the cabinet room.
I don't want to abandon the idea of knocking out just these missile bases as opposed to the broader air attacks. What is it in the next 24 hours? What is it that we need to do if we're going to carry out either plan?
Mr. President, you're never going to take out all of it. You'll miss some.
I agree, General. And the larger question is, after we've launched 50 to 100 sorties, what kind of world do we live in? How do we stop at that point? I think tonight we ought to work on the consequences of any one of these courses of action we're discussing. Consequences which I don't believe are entirely clear to any of us.
The chiefs would prefer no military action rather than to make a limited first strike. It's opening up the United States.
Well, let's not let the chiefs knock us out on this one, General. Because if we take out all of their planes and the rest of it, you really haven't got much of an argument against invading.
Well, personally, Mr. President, my inclination is all against the invasion.
You're not for the invasion?
At the moment, no, sir. We don't want to get committed to the degree that shackles us with Khrushchev in Berlin.
And this is why I say we have to think of the consequences here.
Yeah, Mr. President, I think we should also consider what Cuba's going to be a year from now or 2 years from now. And assume that we go in and knock these sites out. I don't know what's going to stop them from saying we're going to build these sites 6 months from now and bring in those missiles again.
Nothing permanent about it.
You have to put in a blockade following any limited action.
Well, then we're going to have to sink Russian ships. Then we're going to have to sink Russian submarines. And we should consider whether it wouldn't be the argument, if you're going to get into it at all, whether you just get into it and get it over with and take our losses. I mean, hell, if it's war that's going to come on this thing, he sticks those kind of missiles in after the warning, and he's going to get into a war over 6 months from now or a year from now.
Mr. President, this is why I think tonight we ought to put on paper the alternative plans and the probable and possible consequences thereof. And if state and defense disagree with those would be, then put in both views, because the consequences of these actions have not been thought through.
Can I just say, I'm wondering whether we can get involved in this through Guantanamo Bay or whether there's some ship that, sink the Maine again or something.
If anybody can tell me any other time since the Berlin blockade where the Russians have given us so clear a provocation, I don't know when it's been. How did they word their denial that these were Soviet?
I have it. Their public statement from last month here. There is no need for the Soviet Union to shift its weapons to any other country, for instance, Cuba. Our nuclear weapons are so powerful in their explosive force. The Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union.
And they also threaten in there that any action by the United States would lead to nuclear war.
What date was that statement, Mac?
September 11th.
When the missiles were already there.
Or on the way.
All right. I'm due at dinner. It's on my schedule. And as I said, it's important to maintain that we're sticking to our schedules.
I would suggest that the rest of us continue this discussion at the State Department. It's unlikely a late meeting over there would raise suspicions. We can discuss further these alternatives that Secretary McNamara mentioned.
Which will really be what happens. I think any military action we take changes the world. And I think not taking action changes the world.
And these are the two worlds we need to look at.
We debated into the night as many variants of every option we could think of. And because the situation was so critical, this situation was so unpredictable, I slept on a cot in my office at the Pentagon. And I kept asking myself, what kind of world do we live in? What action do we take? What do we expect Castro will be doing after we attack these missiles? Does he survive as a political leader? Is he overthrown? Is he stronger, weaker? How will the Soviets react? How could Khrushchev not make some kind of rebuttal? How does this affect our allies' support of us in relation to Berlin? Every option is knotted up with multiple consequences. None of them acceptable, really. I didn't get much sleep.
We always prayed together as a family. Morning prayers, grace before meals, and evening prayers. It's one of my favorite memories. A special time in our family, all of us together. No matter if father or mother were traveling or some of us were away at school or military duty. At home, we said our prayers together. Today, Wednesday, October 17th, is the National Day of Prayer. On his way out of town to campaign in New England, Jack stopped at St. Matthew's Church. It was closed to the public while he was inside, praying alone. I'm pretty sure I know what he prayed for. Same thing we all did.
Mr. Attorney General, I have the president calling from Connecticut.
Thank you.
Any progress down there?
Well, the Joint Chiefs had their staffs working through the night on the comprehensive military response.
Yeah.
They're still opposed to any strikes that target only missile sites.
They want to go in full bore.
Yeah, but most of our group is now moving off airstrikes and instead leaning toward taking some kind of political strategy first.
What Adlai wants.
Now, letting Khrushchev know that we know about the missiles and that they have to be taken out immediately. Or, we'll respond in line with your previous statements.
But then you'd be giving the Soviets advance notice.
Now, wait a minute, Bob. If such an approach were taken in conjunction with the mobilization that the Joint Chiefs proposed,
you'd be giving them time to take measures that could render a strike less effective, or perhaps even strike first.
Did Tommy Thompson say anything about Khrushchev? He knows him better than anyone.
My wife and I lived with Khrushchev for a year, and I think to him this is entirely about Berlin. We should keep that in mind.
I agree, Tommy. This is all about Berlin.
Now, we also have the option of a blockade, which we really haven't discussed to any great degree.
Instead of airstrikes or in addition?
A blockade would require a declaration of war.
Against Cuba or the Soviet Union?
If the United States were simply to declare war on a country so much smaller than ours...
Danny is suggesting we declare war on the Soviet Union?
I'm not suggesting, Mac, we declare war on any country.
Well, there's a Soviet deployment 90 miles off the coast of America. They're probably shipping nuclear warheads over there right this minute. We cannot let that stand.
Keep at it. I don't think we have very much time.
We worked through the night again.
I don't believe I've ever changed my position on a single issue so many times.
As I see it, we have 5 options. Nope, 6.
Bob, you always enumerate everything. Honey, I love you, and let me give you 3 reasons why.
That's why they call him the computer.
Yeah, but he's still the one all my sisters want to sit next to at dinner.
I've gone back and forth so much on this. I find that now I'm beginning to think the correct course is a strike without warning after all.
With no warning, no negotiating
Just
first.
go in and take the damn things out.
But you'd never get everything.
If the alternative is to leave them in place...
With the work going on...
We're punching blind here. Without the full intelligence, we can't consider all the consequences.
Well, do we have the luxury of waiting for the full intelligence?
I think we should try to approach Khrushchev first.
Thursday morning, October 18th, the Cabinet Room. As is now the custom, we start with a briefing from John McCone of the CIA.
Our analysts found some new, and I think we'll all agree, important developments in these latest U-2 photos. We've now identified, you see them here, fixed intermediate range ballistic missile sites, IRBMs, which had been previously undetected. These missiles have a range of 2,200 miles.
More than twice that of the MRBMs we initially identified.
Correct. Given their yield, these missiles could destroy the entire continental United States, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest.
Mr. President, it has been the view of the chiefs, and certainly my view, that very limited airstrikes against very limited targets would be quite inconclusive, very risky, and almost certainly lead to further military action. Therefore, the chiefs and I now consider nothing short of full invasion as applicable military action.
And how did you reach that conclusion, Bob?
If I may, Mr. President, we can't take out this threat by actions from the air alone. Invasion is going to be required. Conceivably, diplomatic action might stop it, but only diplomatic action or occupation, as far as I can see, can prevent this kind of threat from building up.
The question is really whether the Soviet reaction, and who knows this, would be measurably different if they were given a chance to pull the missiles out. What do you think, Tommy?
If you do this first strike, you'll kill a lot of Russians, and that would make aggressive retaliation from their side inevitable. My preference is the blockade plan. I think it's highly doubtful that the Russians would resist a blockade against military weapons, particularly offensive ones, if that's the way we pitched it before the world. They have a curious faculty of wanting a legal basis, despite all the outrageous things they've done, and I think it would greatly deter them.
What do we do with the weapons already there?
Demand they're dismantled and maintain constant surveillance until they, or perhaps we, have taken them all out.
A blockade is a very slow death. As it builds up and goes over a period of months, you've got all these people yelling and screaming about it. You got the examination of Russian ships and the shooting down of Russian planes. You have to do all those things.
I think Khrushchev will deny that these are Soviet bases. He'll say, what are you getting so excited about? These are much less offensive than your weapons in Turkey. These are simply to deal with the threat to Cuba.
Well, that would be patently false on its face because of the nature of the weapons.
You want to make it easy for him to back down. If we impose a blockade, I think almost certainly he would say, this is so serious, I want to talk to you about it.
He'll try to trade off a blockade on Cuba with one on Berlin. Then you start to talk.
That's what he would figure.
The only offer we would make, it seems to me, that would have any sense, according to him, would be our missiles in Turkey.
Well, I believe, Mr. President, that offer is equally valid if we make the sudden strike. It may well be important to have a message in Khrushchev's hands at that moment, saying that we understand this base problem and that we do expect to dismantle our Turkish base.
All right, say there is a strike without a preliminary discussion with Khrushchev. How many Soviet citizens will be killed? I don't know. It'd be several hundred at absolute minimum. We're using napalm, 750-pound bombs. This is an extensive strike we're talking about. And then what kind of response does Khrushchev have open to him? It seems to me that it just must be a strong response, and I think we should expect that. And therefore, the question really is, are we willing to pay a rather substantial price to eliminate these missiles? I think the price is going to be high. At the very least, it'll be to remove the missiles in Turkey.
Yeah, Mr. President, I think it's easy sitting here to underestimate the kind of sense of affront that you would have among our allies if we act without warning, without giving Khrushchev some way out. The course of action where we strike without warning is like Pearl Harbor. It's not who we are as a country. I think giving Khrushchev 24 hours is indispensable.
And then if he says, well, if you do that, we're going to seize Berlin.
Then we go ahead.
He's going to seize Berlin anyway.
We pay that price.
Well, then our allies will feel we lost Berlin because of these missiles, which really don't bother them.
What do we do when he moves into Berlin?
Does he take it with Soviet troops?
That's what it would seem to me.
We have U.S. troops there. What do?
They fight.
They fight. I think that's perfectly clear.
And they get overrun.
Yes, they get overrun, exactly.
You have a direct confrontation, then what do we do?
Go to general war, consider the use
You
of...
mean a nuclear exchange?
Yes, you'd have to.
Seems to me, I'm talking about the alliance for a moment. We've got two problems. One would be when we say to our allies that the presence of these missiles requires military action by us. There's no doubt that they will oppose that because they feel that their risks increase and the missiles are a risk largely only to us. And if we don't take any action, then I suppose there will be a more gradual deterioration of the alliance.
I think it will happen very fast.
Very rapid.
So the question really is what action we take that lessens the chances of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure, and at the same time maintain some degree of solidarity with our allies. To get a blockade, would we have to declare a war on Cuba?
Yes.
If you're going to do that, it doesn't make any sense not to invade. But let's think with this a minute. We do the messages to Khrushchev and tell him that if work continues, et cetera, at the same time, we launch the blockade. If work continues, we go in and take the missiles out. That's one option.
And the great difficulty of a blockade without a declaration of war is that it becomes an illegal blockade, an act of aggression against everybody else, including our allies.
What? You could have a blockade imposed under Article 8 of the Rio Treaty.
Okay, now, another prospective course of action is that tomorrow afternoon, Friday, I announce the existence of these missiles and say that we're calling Congress back. Everybody knows about it, so it isn't Pearl Harbor in that sense. Then we go ahead Saturday and take them out.
And take out their Air Force.
And announce if any more are put in, we're going to take those out too.
I think just the whole question, of assuming that you do survive all this is what kind of a country we are. We talked for 15 years about the Russians someday carrying out a first strike against us, and we'd never do that. Now, in interest of time, we do that to a small country. I think it's a hell of a burden to carry.
History wouldn't forget it.
Let's just say if we make this announcement, the afternoon before, we send a message to Khrushchev saying that we said we'd have to do it. You ought to get the Russians out of there within the next 12 hours. Now, we lose a good deal of advantage as far as surprise, but what, of course, we're trying to do is get these missiles.
One thing we haven't mentioned, Mr. President, is the fact that we still don't have all the intelligence. I'm impressed with how our minds have changed on this in 24 hours, based on this last intelligence on these longer-range missiles. I think before we really commit ourselves, we ought to get the full picture on this island.
I agree.
We haven't much time.
Mr. President, I think the thing that is lacking is not more intelligence, although that will modify our position somewhat. What's lacking here is a real, well-thought-out course of action, or alternative courses of action. I think we ought to go back this afternoon and split up into a couple of groups. Assign one group one course of action, another group another course of action, and work them out in great detail. One would be a rapid introduction to military action, a brief notice to Khrushchev, followed by a strike. The other course is a political statement, followed or accompanied by a blockade. I confess I'm not clear which of these two courses we should follow.
It really has come down to these two after talking about this for 48 hours.
No, this afternoon should be interesting. I have this meeting with Soviet Minister Gromyko that was scheduled weeks ago.
Does it give us any advantage to let him know?
He lied. Dobrinin lied.
I'm not sure Ambassador Dobrinin knew about the missiles. It's more likely that Gromyko would have known.
Until we have a clear course of action, I think I'll hold our cards close to the vest. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon,
Mr. President. Two groups, then.
Military strike or
blockade?
At the moment, I lean toward blockade.
Rather than all-out invasion?
I know, it sounds like I'm changing my mind.
Well, we all have, and changed back again, and again.
Over at the State Department, we spent all this afternoon working on written arguments for both courses of action. And then we took a little dinner break, which gave me a chance to see my wife for the first time in the last 2 days.
That evening, Thursday, October 18th, the State Department.
Gromyko lied through his fucking teeth. That's a quote from the president. While Gromyko did admit there are Russians working in Cuba, he's sticking to the story that they're only there to show the Cubans how to operate their defensive missiles.
I would expect he'd say no less.
And he spouted the same old horse shit as Khrushchev, that they wouldn't do anything to embarrass the president before the elections. But he warned that after the elections, the Russians would be compelled, that's his word, to get us out of Berlin.
Berlin is the objective.
The president told Gromyko we're looking at the most dangerous situation our two countries have faced since the end of the war. He wants us to go back to the White House now.
Mary, my wife, knows nothing of the crisis, but like nearly everybody, she knows something is underway in Cuba, and it scares her. She asked me something over dinner that's been troubling me since. Was I sure we were doing everything we could to avoid war?
Later that evening, very late, the cabinet room.
Mr. President, the consensus appears to be that the most prudent course of action is some form of blockade.
Before we go too far down this path, Mr. President.
Mac?
I'm beginning to wonder whether at this time any action at all is necessary.
While the Soviets continue installing these missiles.
Well, I don't think we've fully considered the extent of likely Soviet reprisals for any action we take.
We know that they would certainly move on Berlin.
Well, we don't, Dean. We're guessing, and it's a good guess, and I agree that it's a likely move, but the United States would bear the responsibility for all that follows, including possibly a serious fracturing of the alliance.
How do you propose we get the missiles out, Mac?
Well, frankly, Bobby, I don't know. I don't think any of us know, but I think for now we could just keep an eye on them. Take note of their existence with the Soviets and wait to act when and if a crunch comes in Berlin.
I just feel that course of action, which is no action, throws into question our commitment to Berlin.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily.
And I think it would seriously divide the country.
While the Soviets build up a huge arsenal in the Western Hemisphere, and we have the same problems we'd be facing in Berlin anyway.
Which is the Soviet game. What I am proposing, John, is that we don't get sucked into playing it their way.
Mac, no course of action is going to be perfect. The situation is too complex. But I don't think any of us can argue any longer against the reality that the time for confrontation is here. And looking into the future, I think it would be better for our children and our grandchildren if we face the Soviet threat, stand up to it, and eliminate it now. The circumstances for doing so at some time in the future are bound to be more unfavorable, the risks greater, the chances of success less good. So we must act. The question is, what action do we take? Airstrike? Blockade? I don't know. It's like the poet Aeschylus wrote. Pain both ways, and what is worse? Now, the worst pain will surely come if we do nothing.
I believe it was also the poet Aeschylus who said, "Gentlemen, we'll pick this up again in the morning." Bob.
Yes, Mr. President.
Let's start making preparations for a military column of at least battalion strength to be ready to move on Berlin down the Autobahn on 2 hours' notice if necessary.
Will do. I'm headed back to the Pentagon now.
Spending the night there again.
You know, Castro only gets about 3 hours sleep. I imagine he spends most of the night puffing cigars, pacing and ranting against the United States, convinced we'll invade any minute. And now he's got nuclear weapons. I don't dare spend the night anywhere but the Pentagon. Good night, Mr. President.
Jack, aren't you coming to bed?
What time is it?
Past 1. What's going on? Is it something you can talk about?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
All right. You'll come to bed then?
In a minute. Jackie, I want you to take the children and stay out of Washington for a little while. Take them out to Glenora.
Oh, the house is a sheer catastrophe. The contractors have half of it ripped out to the stud.
Just do it, please.
Why?
You'll have to trust me.
I'd like to know why.
It's for your safety.
Will it be for long?
I hope not.
Jack, if something awful is about to happen...
Don't think about that.
I want to be with you when it comes.
Friday, October 19th, the Cabinet Room.
Mac, you look like hell. Well, then again, I suppose no one's getting much sleep.
No, sir.
Strangely enough, I've been sleeping just fine. One of the benefits of being medicated to the gills.
Mr. President, before the chiefs come in, I've just been briefed by John McCone.
And?
This morning, the CIA analysts determined that 8 intermediate-range SS-4 ballistic missiles at the San Cristobal site are now on launchers. And 8 more are poised for a second round. They have all been determined to be operational.
This is from the latest photos?
Yes. And there's more. They also found 8 other SS-4s across the island. Should be operational within the week.
Do we know if they have warheads, if they're...
No, we don't know. And we may not know without actually going in there, but it looks like there's a storage facility for nuclear warheads being built near Havana.
Is it still your opinion that we should watch and wait?
Any action we take could lead to
Mac,
war.
you're my national security advisor. The Joint Chiefs are walking down the hall this second.
But
I need
in
to
view
know...
of these 24 missiles ready or near ready to be shot at us...
What action do you recommend we take?
If we impose a blockade, with or without a retaliatory blockade in Berlin, the missiles will still be in place with work continuing.
Mac.
We cannot let those missiles stand. The only move I can see that makes any sense would be comprehensive airstrikes.
Which is what General Curtis LeMay and the rest of the Joint Chiefs think, too.
We don't have any choice except direct military action.
But General LeMay, they can't just let us take out, after all their statements, take out their missiles, kill a lot of Russians, and not do anything.
Well, history has been the other way, Mr. President. Where we have taken a strong stand, they have backed off.
If they go in and take Berlin by force, it leaves me only one alternative, which is to fire nuclear weapons. Which is a hell of an alternative to begin a nuclear exchange with all this happening.
Well, I see no other solution. A blockade will lead right into war. Because these fanatics have got MiGs, they'll fly against us. Their IL-28s are going to fly against us. A blockade and political action is too weak a response to this threat. As bad as the appeasement at Munich.
That was a low blow, and General LeMay knew it.
As bad as the appeasement at Munich.
My brother Joe was killed in the war. So was our brother-in-law Billy. And the whole world knows that Jack barely survived when a Japanese destroyer rammed into his PT boat. And say what you will about the Kennedys. And there's very little that hasn't been. We know what it means to go to war.
Well, let me ask, if we go ahead with this airstrike, either on the missiles or on the missiles and the planes, and I understand the recommendation is to do both, when could we be ready?
We could be ready for attack at dawn on the 21st.
Sunday, 3 days from now.
Although in terms of preparation, the optimum date would be Tuesday.
And the invasion?
You could start 7 days after the airstrike, going on for about 11 days.
Whatever we do, it's a naughty mess with no perfect solution. You're in a pretty bad fix.
What did you say?
You're in a pretty bad fix.
Well, you're in there with me, General. Personally.
What do the brass hats want you to do?
They think we're walking right into war no matter what we do. Well, they have one thing in their favor. We do what they want, no one will be alive later to tell them they were wrong.
We'll keep at it while you're in Chicago.
But if it is going to be war, I have to be sure there was no other way. Our only hope to avoid it is to give Khrushchev room to pull back. But perhaps a blockade is too weak a response.
Oh, Mr. President, sorry, one more thing. Reporters are calling. The Times, Washington Post, some others, they either know or they sense something important's underway.
Don't call them back. We have to hold this, at least until Sunday.
That when we act?
Well, as of this morning, there are 24 IRBMs ready to be fired at the United States. Don't see how we can wait much longer.
Later that morning, Friday, October 19th, the Cabinet Room.
Gentlemen, I told the President this morning before our meeting with the chiefs that I am beginning to favor some sort of decisive action.
Yesterday, you were against taking any action.
What type of decisive action are you talking about, Mac?
Decisive action with the advantages of surprise and...
The airstrike.
With or without
No,
prior
let me
notice
finish.
to
Decisive
Khrushchev.
action with the advantages of surprise and confronting the world with a fait accompli.
So, no notice.
Hit only the missiles, or the missiles plus the airfield?
Followed
plus every
by
other
an invasion or no invasion?
Did we or did we not reach consensus on the blockade option
It's
last
not
night?
fair to the president to reconsider this after we all agreed.
Ted, I don't think we were in any sense of the word unanimous.
Well, even
on
if we
that.
were.
I think Mac has a very good point.
We cannot go in and bomb a small country with no prior warning, without giving them some opportunity for the other side to take action that could have avoided the horror that we will surely inflict on them. We would lose all moral credibility with our allies and with other countries and with history. We cannot do that.
Bobby, the point you just made is exactly what nags at me and is what's made me change my mind so many times in the last few days. I believe that we're all aware that the choices confronting us are a thorny thicket and that the sands of this crisis are rapidly pouring through the hourglass. So what I would suggest would be that we break into two groups again, blockade and airstrike, and each group debate within itself and then compose a document that details the possible scenarios for each option, and then swap documents for the other side to comment, and then we swap back again until we are absolutely certain we can say that whatever action we recommend the president take has been thought through as fully as possible. I'd be happy to tackle the blockade argument.
I'll join you, Dean.
Me too.
And me.
And for the airstrike route?
I'll take it.
General Taylor?
Let's get to work.
Let's do it.
Saturday morning, October. Excuse me.
Long night. October 20th.
Mr. Attorney General, I have the president now.
Did you reach a consensus?
Most of us favor a blockade, but now McNamara and the brass have a pretty compelling argument for airstrikes, too. Possibly as part of an overall blockade strategy. I don't think there's any further aspect of either option to be debated. Basically, now it's up to you to make a decision. How soon can you get back?
I'm supposed to be here all weekend, but I'll tell Pierre to concoct a cover story and be back by lunchtime.
President Kennedy has cut short his campaign swing through the Midwest due to a bad cold and is returning to Washington today.
The White House press secretary explained that strict doctor's orders prompted the president's return.
Hello?
How's the weather in Virginia?
Oh, Jack, it's absolutely gorgeous. Caroline and I are carving a jack-o'-lantern, and John's making neat little piles of leaves on the... Caroline, put that knife down. What did Mommy tell you? How's your phony cold?
Bad enough to force me back to Washington.
I see.
I have to make a decision. Maybe the most important decision I'll ever have to make. I want my family with me.
We'll be back in time for evening prayers.
Saturday, October 20th, the White House. We heard the press was staking out the gate, sensing something was underway, so we staggered our arrivals and hid under dashboards and behind seats to throw them off.
Before the meeting, the president ordered 4 air squadrons to full tactical alert.
Gentlemen, today we are going to earn our pay. And you should all hope that yours isn't the proposal that's accepted.
Mr. President, we have both proposals, blockade and airstrike, in the form of an address for each that you would make to inform the country of the action that's being taken. Here is the speech for the blockade route. It seeks to prevent any addition to the strategic missiles currently deployed and details some of the options for their removal.
It also provides for more direct action once the blockade takes effect.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Until now, when we've met in the White House, it's always been in the cabinet room around the big table. But we're in the Oval Room today because, well, the reason's right there under Jack's ass. His rocking chair. It reduces the pressure on his back and the pain, which has to be extreme, given that the decision he makes could be the difference between war and peace. But he's not letting it show. He never does.
Mr. President, although we refer to this strategy among ourselves as a blockade, the State Department lawyers recommend it be called a defensive quarantine.
What's the rationale?
A blockade would be an act of war, whereas a quarantine is enacted as a preventive against something dangerous.
The Russians will call it a blockade no matter what.
We should probably expect that once the quarantine is in place, we will have to negotiate for the removal of our missiles in Turkey and Italy.
I agree, Bob, and we can reassure those countries and the alliance that they will actually be better protected by our Polaris submarines in the Mediterranean, along with air support.
It will be very risky to threaten an air attack on Cuba with Soviet missiles in place. We should tell Khrushchev that we consider those to be Soviet missiles. And then if they are used against us, we'll retaliate by launching our missiles against the Soviet Union.
Very well. And the airstrike proposal?
Yeah, right here, Mr. President.
One aspect of the airstrike plan I feel I should point out is we have a prime opportunity here, not only to take out the missiles and the launchers, but also to take out the IL-28 bombers, which at the moment are neatly lined up on the Cuban airfield.
Although, General, as you pointed out before, there's no way an airstrike can take out all the missiles and launchers. At best, we're only looking at being able to take out 2/3 of them.
We have to do better than that, because if those missiles and launchers and bombers are not destroyed, then the United States will have to change its entire military way of dealing with external threats.
While that sounds impressive and urgent, a sudden airstrike has no support in the law or morality, and therefore I think should be ruled out.
If we gave advance warning, a short window for the Soviets to evacuate their personnel.
We could live with 24 hours notice before commencing any air activities.
Well, can I just say that I think, after all our debate and examination, the approach that I would find most attractive is a sort of combination of the approaches. And that would be to initiate the blockade. And if we confirm through our surveillance and other intelligence that work is continuing on the missile sites, we then inform the Russians that we are about to destroy them. It gives them an opportunity to stop the work, and we wouldn't be carrying out a Pearl Harbor-type attack.
I would agree.
And I would argue that a blockade doesn't end the missile threat. The use of military force is inevitable.
Mr. President, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have detailed plans for an airstrike of 800 sorties, so we're ready for that. We can do that. And if we do that, we can expect several thousand Russians will be killed, chaos in Cuba, and as General Taylor has just pointed out, a probable invasion. I doubt very strongly that the Soviets would simply take that and not launch a very major response. And when that comes, the United States would lose control of the situation, and we would very quickly be in general war.
I agree that an airstrike would probably prompt them to blockade Berlin, and we will, at some point, acknowledge that we're willing to remove the missiles in Turkey. I also think we'd have that same outcome if we go ahead with this blockade plan. General, you said we could initiate an airstrike. How quickly?
3 days, though we could move more quickly if necessary.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. On Monday, 2 days from now, I'll announce to the American people and the world, I'll announce the presence of Soviet offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba, that we demand their immediate removal, and that we are implementing a quarantine to prevent any future shipments.
The blockade option.
General, I know you and your colleagues will be unhappy that that's my decision, but I trust I'll have your full support in carrying it out.
Without question, Mr. President.
Meanwhile, we continue preparations for an airstrike, and if it becomes necessary, I'll authorize preparatory action for the invasion. Now, from here out, despite which action any of us personally preferred, we are all singing one song. It's essential that we make it clear that this was the only action to pursue, that this was consensus after days of looking at the situation from all sides.
Yes, Mr. President.
And to those of you whose choice wasn't adopted, let me just say you should be happy, because I'm pretty sure the ones who did are going to be sorry.
Things are suddenly happening very quickly.
At Guantanamo, we've started evacuating children and all women who aren't nurses. Every incoming plane to the island is filled with soldiers to take their places.
The president's recalling Congress, and they'll know that means a crisis and figure it's Cuba. But most of them are busy campaigning, and, well, it's like pulling a baby off a lollipop. They're going to be crabby and sticky and won't like you one damn bit.
I briefed my counterparts in the OAS who all expressed support for the quarantine. And we have special emissaries going out across the globe to brief the leaders of our closest allied countries.
Monday, October 22nd, the president makes his speech to the country tonight.
He called Presidents Hoover, Truman, and Eisenhower this morning, who all said they support what he's doing. Although Eisenhower thinks we're going to have to go in and blow everything up before this ends anyway.
President Kennedy's either been on the phone or meeting with the National Security Committee, going over the proposal again and again. And he's been spending time with his children since they returned, much more time than usual.
We've spent hours redrafting and redrafting his speech, the final version of which is in the process of being wired to our embassy in Moscow right now.
Early evening, Monday, October 22nd. 3 hours until the president delivers the speech on television.
The Truman balcony.
Ted, did you know that Truman claims he's never regretted using the atomic bomb?
You think that's true?
Don't see how it could be, but maybe. You used to do that?
Hide under a pile of dead leaves?
Yeah.
And then you'd set the leaves on fire.
You tried to burn your little brother?
Yeah, the game was how long he could stay without getting burned.
You Kennedys take play very seriously.
And we take winning very seriously.
What I can't stop thinking about more than anything else is the children. All the children, young people in this country and all over the world, who know nothing about this crisis, have no voice in how it's handled. If we make a mistake, might never have the chance to have a future. To run for office, to lead a revolution, cast a vote, or determine their own destinies. If we make a mistake, that's the danger in this, a mistake. Miscalculation. In Vienna over lunch, I asked Khrushchev if he's ever made a mistake.
What was his answer?
Wouldn't give me one.
Excuse me, Mr. President. It's time for you to brief the cabinet.
This should be interesting. Most of them don't have a clue about what's been going on.
While the president's with his cabinet, heavy black drapes are going up in front of the windows of the Oval Office, and banks of lights and cameras and microphones are rolling in.
Right now, an hour before the speech, a copy is being hand-delivered to the Kremlin, along with a private letter from President Kennedy to Chairman Khrushchev.
The president's meeting with the cabinet was a walk in the park. He's briefing the congressional leaders now.
Fuck them! They want this job, they can have it. It's no great joy to me.
What do they say?
Totally against anything that's not aggressive military action. Wouldn't even consider how a knee-jerk response like that could set off a nuclear war that no one would be able to stop.
All they care about is looking tough to the voters and don't give a damn...
About the consequences.
About the consequences, exactly.
It's easy to talk about airstrikes and going to war and beating the Russians, even if it takes years and 1 million men. They're so used to talking about billions of dollars and millions of soldiers that thousands of casualties sound like drops in the bucket. But if those thousands want to live as much as the 11 of us, left for dead in the Pacific, fighting fatigue and fear. For years, I've been carrying this Lincoln quote in my wallet. It says, "I know there is a God, and I see a storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe I am ready." Never understood more how he felt. Yes.
Excuse me, Mr. President, but I wanted to let you know that, as you ordered, our military forces around the world have started executing orders to go to defensive condition 3.
3 is...
Normal peacetime readiness is DEFCON 5. DEFCON 1 is general nuclear war.
So now we're halfway there.
Yes.
200 planes carrying nuclear bombs will shortly be over the length and breadth of the country awaiting orders to proceed to the Soviet Union or any other targets you designate. The pilots have release documents around their necks and fully loaded 38s strapped to their belts.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purposes of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Like, I suspect, most of the country, the members of our committee went to bed that night not knowing if we would wake up the next morning. I went home to my family and we said our evening prayers together, and then I read Green Eggs and Ham to the kids until they were all fast asleep.
Jack went to bed early. He hadn't had much rest all day, and only a brief swim.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
He slept unusually soundly.
I think he was the only one who could.
president's message last night was met with muted anxiety across the country as the potential for nuclear war between the two superpowers increases.
The Pentagon announced that over 300 American ships are en route to enforce the quarantine. Thousands of troops and thousands of tons of equipment are now making their way to Florida and Georgia as part of the greatest mobilization of U.S. military power since the Korean War.
Across the country, students drilled in duck and cover came to school this morning knowing that if they hear the alarm bell, this time it would not be a drill.
Although Americans flocked to grocery stores within minutes of the president's broadcast, the only reported incidents of supermarket panic were in Los Angeles, California.
Tuesday morning, the 23rd of October, the West Wing entrance.
Morning, Mr. Secretary.
Ted. Good morning.
Mr. Rusk?
I'm still here. First thing, when I woke today, I thought, I'm still here. That's very interesting. Mr. Khrushchev must have decided not to respond to last night's announcement by launching nuclear missiles.
It's still early.
Have you heard anything from him?
I understand a letter's coming over the teletype right now.
Mr. President, I should say frankly that measures outlined in your statement represent serious threat to peace and security of people. It cannot be evaluated in any other way than as naked interference in the domestic affairs of the Cuban Republic, the Soviet Union, and other states. It is self-understood that we cannot recognize the right of the United States to establish control over armaments essential to the Republic of Cuba for strengthening its defensive capacity. We confirm that armaments now on Cuba, regardless of classification, are destined exclusively for defensive purposes in order to secure the Cuban Republic from attack of aggressor. I hope the government of the United States will show prudence and renounce actions pursued by you, which could lead to catastrophic consequences for peace throughout the world. Signed, N. Khrushchev.
I suppose we can anticipate difficulties in Berlin. John, is there anything in our intelligence?
Our intelligence shows no deployment of troops toward Berlin, or Turkey, for that matter.
Mr. Rusk, any word from the Organization of American States?
The official vote this morning was unanimous. A violation of the Rio Treaty was declared, and they endorsed our course of action.
Unanimous.
With 2 abstentions. The United States now has the legal authority to enact the quarantine.
The official quarantine proclamation should be ready for your signature any minute.
And Ambassador Stevenson is making his presentation to the Security Council right about now.
With the photographs?
Yes, should make quite an impression.
I expect that we'll have the Russians gunning for our U-2 planes.
We are maintaining aircraft on alert, Mr. President, that have the capability, if you decide to do so, to shoot any surface-to-air missile site that shoots down a U-2.
Then I would think that what we do is, when the first U-2 is shot down and we take out the offending SAM site, we announce what happened. And we say that if any further reconnaissance planes are shot at, which are authorized by the OAS, correct?
Yes.
Then all these SAM sites are going to be destroyed.
Absolutely.
Where are we with everything we need to be doing if this is leading up to an invasion?
The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions are on the move.
And all of their equipment?
Yes, and the Marine Expeditionary Brigade is moving from the West Coast, and the Armored Division from Fort Hood is moving to the East Coast.
Mr. President, there's one other item to send this additional message to Chairman Khrushchev. Shall I read it aloud?
Go ahead.
I hope that you will issue immediately the necessary instructions to your ships to observe the terms of the quarantine, the basis of which was established by the Organization of American States and which will go into effect at 1400 hours Greenwich time, October 24.
We believe there are currently 8 Soviet ships that could reach the quarantine perimeter within the next 24 hours.
Okay, then what do we do when they sail on? We're all clear on how to handle it?
Shoot the rudders off them, don't you?
Well, General, this is a problem. We ought to try to avoid shooting a ship, a Soviet ship, carrying wheat to Cuba or medicine or something of that kind. And this will be difficult because we have to try to see in advance what the ships have.
Bob, I would think that if they have a vessel with cargo of offensive weapons, that's the one I think they would turn around.
But the instruction from Khrushchev is very likely to be don't stop under any circumstances. So if a ship carrying baby food comes out and we hail it and they don't stop, we shoot it.
And regardless of whatever cargo they may be carrying, they're going to keep going. And we're going to try to shoot the rudder off or the boiler. And then we're going to try to board it. They're going to fire a gun. And machine guns. And we're going to have one hell of a time getting aboard that thing and getting control of it because they're pretty tough. There may be armed soldiers or Marines. So I would think that the taking of those ships is going to be a major operation. May have to sink it rather than take it.
Or they might give orders to blow it up or something.
But I think that's less likely than having a real fight because they may have 500, 600, 700 people aboard with guns. I'll tell you, for those who consider the blockade course to be the easy way, I told you not to do it.
We should anticipate there will be some problems with submarines. If we board a ship and Soviet submarines are really moving in, the chief of naval operations is concerned about the possibility that they'll try to sink one of our major vessels, such as an aircraft carrier.
We do know that a Russian submarine refueled yesterday in the Azores and may be moving west.
It's obviously going to move into the Cuba area. There may be others we're not aware of.
Have we got the Enterprise in this area?
Yes.
Do we want to keep her there? We don't want to lose a carrier right away.
Well, she's not near the Soviet ship that we're watching most closely, which is called the Kimovs.
I think we can keep tabs on the submarines.
It's essential that we do.
Yes, sir.
Looks like it could get real mean, doesn't it? Looks like hell.
Well, there isn't any choice. I mean, you would have been impeached.
That's what I think. Would have been impeached. But if the Russians get real mean on this, it's just a question of where they go about it next. I don't think there was a choice.
Oh, you couldn't have done any less. And the fact that you got all those South American countries and Central American countries to vote unanimously when they've been kicking us in the ass for 2 years.
Yeah.
And they vote unanimously on this. And you get the reaction from the rest of the Allies saying you had to do it.
Yeah. There wasn't any other choice.
That night, Tuesday, October 23rd, the Soviet embassy, the residential apartment of Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin.
Mr. Attorney General, come in.
You lied to me.
Shall we not...
You lied to the president. You lied to the American people.
Some coffee?
The president thought he had an understanding with your country. With Chairman Khrushchev. Now he feels personally betrayed by Khrushchev, by Gromyko, by you.
There is no reason.
He didn't lie to any of you.
That is a naive assumption.
It's the truth.
A biscuit with your coffee.
When leaders of great countries give assurances to one another on such matters as these,
Mr. Attorney
matters
General,
that are critical to the survival of the human race.
Please do not.
Did you or did you not tell me just 6 weeks ago, at the same time those missile sites were going into Cuba, that the Soviet Union would not place any missiles in Cuba that could reach the continental United States?
That is exactly.
And had no intentions of doing so in the future.
That is exactly what
and
I told
based
you.
on that statement, and the September statement from TASS, and the private channel communication with Chairman Khrushchev, the president took a much less belligerent stand than others in our government.
Yes, we've heard Senators Keating and Goldwater.
He's done all he could to hold back the Hawks, and taken a lot of heat on it. And because he believed you, he's been called weak on Russia, weak on Cuba, an appeaser.
As you Americans are fond of boasting, you live under a system where anyone can openly criticize your leaders.
Do you or do you not understand that your lies put the peace between our countries in jeopardy?
I must insist that you stop characterizing statements made
The peace
in
of the
good
world.
faith. I told you there were no offensive missiles in Cuba because this is what I was told. This is what Chairman Khrushchev said.
Then he lied to you too. I'm not here at the request of the president. I came on my own because I want to be sure you know how we feel. How deeply and seriously this betrayed...
Robert, to my knowledge, there are no offensive missiles in Cuba. Have you not considered that your information on these so-called missiles could be wrong?
Our information is not wrong.
Have you traveled to Cuba? Have you seen for yourself?
It's not wrong.
Your coffee has turned cold.
What instructions have been given to Soviet ships approaching Cuba?
As far as I am aware, they are under orders to ignore any unlawful demands to stop or be searched in the open sea.
Well, I don't know how this is going to end, but we intend to stop your ships.
That would be an act of war.
McNamara?
Mr. Secretary, I have the president for you.
Thank you.
Bob, I know it's late.
No. We're all wide awake with the quarantine taking effect in a few hours.
Everybody know the protocol.
I was downstairs just a few moments ago reviewing that very thing with Admiral Anderson. I was clear with the Admiral, very clear. We're not trying to start a war, we're trying to send a political message. No shots fired unless expressly ordered by you. Was there anything else, Mr. President?
The perimeter. I was telling Ambassador Ormsby Gore at dinner tonight that we set the quarantine perimeter 800 miles out from Havana.
Yes?
But I think we should tighten it up a bit.
How tight?
500.
Well, the commanders recommended 800 miles because
they
feel that would...
500 gives Khrushchev more time to consider pulling out his missiles. I want to avoid him thinking he's being backed into a corner.
Some of the committee feel that he should be.
If we do that, I don't see how war can be avoided.
I'll notify the command 500 miles.
And one more thing. Concurrent with the quarantine taking effect, I'm ordering our armed forces to DEFCON 2.
That will put 145 ICBMs and all our submarine-based missiles and every available bomber, which is somewhere north of 1,400 aircraft, all on full alert, all equipped with nuclear weapons. It's a hell of a lot of bombs. We've never gone to DEFCON 2 before, have we?
Try to get some rack, Mr. Secretary.
You too, Mr. President.
Wednesday, October 24th, the Cabinet Room, a few minutes after the quarantine has gone into effect.
Mr. McCone, does the CIA have any idea how many ships we're looking at down there?
A survey of Soviet shipping shows 16 dry cargo and 6 tanker ships en route to Cuba. 3 have hatches suitable for carrying missiles and have been receiving urgent coded messages from Moscow. There are also 3, possibly 4 Soviet submarines in the Atlantic, one of which is tracking a ship called the Kimovsk.
Mr. President, the Kimovsk is expected to reach the quarantine barrier at approximately noon today, which would be about now, and is a good target for our first intercept, although one of the submarines that Director McCone just referenced is very close, so it's a very dangerous situation.
What kind of ship is going to try to intercept? Destroyer?
The Essex, the aircraft carrier, which has anti-submarine helicopters, will be in the vicinity, and those helicopters will try to divert the submarine.
Mr. President, I have a note just handed to me. It says that we've received information that all 6 Soviet ships currently identified in Cuban waters have either stopped or reversed course.
John, what do you mean, Cuban waters?
I don't know at the moment.
Most of the ships in Cuban waters will be outbound to the Soviet Union. I presume that's what's
why
in the
don't
message.
we find out whether they're talking about the ships leaving Cuba or the ones coming in?
Makes some difference.
I'll find out.
This submarine sinks our destroyer, then what is our proposed reply?
Well, our destroyer first will be moving around all the time, and the submarine is going to be covered by our anti-submarine warfare patrols. Now, we have a signaling arrangement with that submarine to surface, and that has been communicated.
A message was sent to Moscow last night on this, also being communicated to other governments.
We have depth charges that have such a small charge that they can be dropped and they can actually hit the submarine without damaging the submarine.
They're practice depth charges.
Practice depth charges as a warning. When our forces come upon an unidentified submarine, we will ask it to come to the surface for inspection using a depth charge of this type. And
This is it. We're talking about a physical confrontation with our enemy. Jack's looking at me, hand over his mouth, opening and closing his fist, as if we're not in the White House. And he's not president. Just Jack. But his eyes have gone cold and gray, the way they looked when he was 17 and near dead from colitis, and when we learned that our brother Joe had been killed, and Jack's son Patrick died only 2 days old. That same gaze, all those times we relied on one another because the unthinkable was happening.
Therefore, it is the depth charge that is the warning notice and the instruction to surface.
If it doesn't surface, or if he takes some action to assist the merchant ship, are we just going to attack him anyway? At what point are we going to attack him? We don't want to have the first thing we attack be a Soviet ship. I'd much rather have it be a merchant ship.
Mr. President.
What have you got, John?
Those ships were all inbound for Cuba.
And then what do they say they're doing with them?
They've either stopped them or they've reversed direction.
They were all headed to Cuba and they've turned around?
Yes.
I believe we're eyeball to eyeball, and the other fella just blinked.
Jack, they blinked.
We shouldn't be celebrating yet. There's still 20 chances out of 100 that we could be at war with Russia.
Dear Mr. President, I have received your letter of October 23, familiarized myself with it, and I'm answering you. You, Mr. President, are not declaring quarantines, but advancing an ultimatum and threatening us that unless we subordinate ourselves to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. And you wish to convince me to agree with this. What does agreement with such demands mean? This would mean to guide oneself in one's relations with other countries, not by reason, but to intimidate us. And, Mr. President, I cannot agree with this, and I think in your heart you realize that I am correct. I am convinced that in my place you would act in the same way. The Soviet government considers that violation of freedom of the use of international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression, pushing mankind toward the abyss of a world missile nuclear war. Consequently, The Soviet government cannot give instructions to captains of Soviet vessels bound for Cuba to observe the instructions of the American naval forces blockading that island. Our instructions to Soviet mariners are strictly to observe the norms of navigation in international waters and not to retreat from them by even one step. And if the American side violates these rules, it must realize what sort of responsibility will rest on it in that case. Of course, we shall not just be simply observers of piratical actions of American ships on the high seas. We will then be forced to take the measures which we deem necessary and adequate to protect our rights. For this, we have all that is necessary. Respectfully yours, N. Khrushchev.
Late Wednesday night, October 24th, the Oval Office.
Piratical.
He's building a case against the quarantine.
And threatening military confrontation.
Right now, Mr. President, there are now 6 Soviet ships heading toward the quarantine line. One of them, the Bucharest, a tanker, is of particular interest, and we estimate it will reach the line around 7 tomorrow morning local time, 6 a.m. Washington time.
Is that when we test this thing?
Before that's decided, Mr. President, we've just learned of a proposal, a statement you, Tomt, released this evening from the United Nations that proposes the Soviets halt all arms shipments for a few weeks, and we suspend the quarantine as well.
Now, if we take action on the Bucharest, it could look like the United States is trying to block a negotiated solution.
Yeah, we shouldn't suspend the quarantine.
You know, the other day, as I was walking toward the living room, I heard the candy jar on the coffee table being opened. When I went in, Caroline was there, surprised to see me and holding both her fists very tightly closed. And I asked her, Caroline, did you take any candy? She wouldn't answer, so I asked again, then again. The more I backed her into a corner, the more she dug in. She had clearly taken some candy, but if she said yes, she'd be guilty. She said no, she'd be lying. So I finally said, Caroline, answer the question. Did you take the candy? Yes, no, or maybe? And she said maybe. And perhaps the Secretary General ought to put out a message in a manner that gives Mr. Khrushchev a way to say maybe.
Suggest he stop his ships for a few days while talks get underway in New York.
That tone would be more appealing to him.
That's a good approach, and I think we should follow through on that. But it doesn't give Khrushchev enough time to recall the Bucharest.
But either we have a quarantine or we don't.
We have to stop the Bucharest.
But not necessarily board her. We can hail and ask for identification.
When will she reach the barrier?
In about 6 hours.
We have to set an example. Make the intercept. Ask a destination, port of origin, and cargo. Unless we have reason to believe she's carrying something on the order of nuclear warheads, let her through, but keep her under close and constant surveillance.
Mr. President, in view of the fact that the chairman's letter threatens a military response if we stop Soviet ships, I think it's essential that we answer him immediately.
Dear Mr. Chairman, I have received your letter of October 24, and I regret very much that you still do not appear to understand what it is that has moved us in this matter. This government received the most explicit assurances from your government and its representatives, both publicly and privately, that no offensive weapons were being sent to Cuba. In reliance on these solemn assurances, I urged restraint upon those in this country who were urging action in this matter at that time. And then I learned beyond a doubt what you have not denied, namely that all these public assurances were false. I ask you to recognize clearly, Mr. Chairman, that it was not I who issued the first challenge in this case, and that in the light of this record, these activities in Cuba required the responses I have announced.
Thursday morning, the 25th of October. The Cabinet Room.
Gentlemen, early this morning on the order of 7 local time, 6 Eastern Daylight Time, several of our naval ships, a destroyer in particular, intercepted the Bucharest and queried it as to its name, destination, point of origin, and cargo. The Bucharest responded it's from the Black Sea. It was bound for Havana. It was carrying petroleum products. To the best of our knowledge, no other words passed between the ships.
I directed our command to let the Bucharest proceed, but to maintain surveillance.
Mr. President, the country wants to know. It's grown louder in the media. We got this blockade, but we haven't boarded a single ship yet.
We have a diplomatic effort underway at the United Nations.
Meanwhile, work on the missile sites is progressing nonstop over the last several days.
Mr. President, one action the chiefs would like to put before you is to begin initiating a low-level surveillance pattern that is consistent with an air attack.
In addition to our ongoing U-2 surveillance.
There's justification for the increased surveillance, Mr. President, in that they've started camouflaging the surface-to-air missile sites.
The photographs demonstrate it.
And they'll camouflage not just weapons, but various buildings, trucks.
I hope somebody can explain this whole Russian thing someday. Why didn't they camouflage them before? Why would they do it now?
I would suggest that we announce to the Cubans that we are going to carry out surveillance today. And that our planes are unarmed, but if they are attacked, we will attack the attacker.
If this low-level surveillance shows that every single missile site is 8 hours from launch, which the pictures we saw this morning indicated, then we could attack those missiles and have a fair chance of destroying them, and with very few aircraft.
The Cuban forces, to our knowledge, are under orders not to attack. At the very least, there will be confusion if we come over there with a few aircraft and shoot it up.
We recommend a pattern of 2 low-level flights a day.
Let's get that going, then.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Mr. President.
Yeah, John.
I've just been informed, in addition to the 24 intermediate-range missiles that have previously been confirmed to be ready to launch, a moment ago our analysts determined that several of the medium-range ballistic missiles are now fully operational.
They're certain about that?
Yes.
Thank you, John. God damn it.
Jack?
I'm trying to give Khrushchev time to decide to pull out his missiles, but nothing we've done so far has made a goddamn bit of difference. I asked the Pentagon how many people would die if a single Soviet missile got through and hit somewhere near one of our cities.
What's the number?
600,000.
Christ.
600,000.
From one missile.
That's the total number of dead in the Civil War. And 100 years later, we still haven't gotten over it. One missile.
This cup isn't going to pass from us, is it?
They've started making the arrangements to send officials and their families to the shelters in West Virginia.
Yeah, I know. But Ethel and I discussed it with the kids, and they voted for the family to stay together at home.
You gave the kids a vote.
We're teaching them democracy.
Teach them about veto power.
Very late that evening, the residence.
Mr. President, one of the ships that we've been watching, a Lebanese ship with a mostly Greek crew, the Marukla, has been heading for Cuba under Soviet orders after a stop at the port of Riga.
Well, I doubt highly that the ship would be transporting banned Soviet nuclear material.
I agree.
Of course, that's not the point, is it? We're not necessarily expecting to find nuclear material, just making a clear statement about our determination to enforce the quarantine.
Very clear.
I don't want to put Mr. Khrushchev into a corner from which he can't escape.
He only threatened a military response if we stop Soviet ships. At least so far, the Marukla, as I mentioned, is under Lebanese flag.
Then go ahead and stop her and make sure I'm alerted and in touch with the captain of our ship when we've got her.
One more thing. We'll have several ships involved in the intercept, but the lead ship will be the destroyer Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. Navy Command thought it would be a nice touch.
It is. Good night, Bob.
Good night, sir.
Jack, I waited to have supper with you.
The children ready for bed?
Fast asleep.
I wanted to read to them. Bobby says Ethel and the children won't leave Hickory Hill.
I'm not leaving you either.
Remember when I said I wanted my family with me, that I needed you here, and when I had to decide on the quarantine?
Of course.
There are decisions I may have to make now, decisions I can't make unless I know that you and the children are safe. You understand?
Yes, I think so.
I'm not asking you to go to the shelter, just Glenora. Children like it there, and it's far enough away.
You're asking me to leave you, knowing that you could be...
Jackie, please.
Very well, then. We'll go.
We'll be together when this is over. One way or another.
Friday morning, October 26th, the Oval Office.
The boarding party has cast off the Marukla and is in the process of returning to the Kennedy.
Captain, did any of the Marukla crew board the launch with them?
No, sir.
Any sign of force on either side?
None, sir.
Good thing we didn't have to shoot off a rudder.
Did you see the front pages this morning? Celebrations in Havana when the Bucharest docked.
Drunk with national pride, and after this, they'll be even more convinced we're going to invade.
I'm not convinced that we aren't.
Sir, the boarding party returned 10:20 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. No prohibited material in evidence.
Thank you, Captain. Godspeed to you and the crew of the Kennedy.
1 hour later, the cabinet room. Mr. President, despite the quarantine, despite promises of political talks in New York, work on the missile sites has not slowed down. In fact, Director McCone reports every day that it's accelerating.
It is.
The Joint Chiefs are strongly urging you, sir, to implement our plan to set in motion a massive airstrike for a period of 7 days, after which troops would come ashore at Mariel and the full invasion would be underway.
Made up of 8 divisions, a total of 120,000 troops moving eastward across the 40-mile front.
We're fully mobilized. If you were to give the order right now, we'd have planes in the air within 12 hours.
I would also suggest that we send out immediately 8 to 10 aircraft to go on daylight surveillance. And send out 4 aircraft tonight on nighttime surveillance. These would be using flares, roughly 10 flares per target, illuminating the target area and surrounding territory for photographs.
Mr. President, I wonder whether we ought to hold off on that until we've had a crack at the UTOMP negotiations.
Why? Is the nighttime surveillance provocative?
Well, the Pathfinder flares are frequently used with bombs right behind them, and we're not sure what the interpretation on the other side might be.
We could give a warning ahead of time that they're
That's
not
very
actually
important to announce it, because otherwise the danger the Secretary speaks of is very real.
It'll look like we're playing 4th of July over there or something. Imagine some crazy Russian captain. The damn thing goes blue, he lights up the skies, he just might pull the trigger. We need to play this like 2 porcupines making love. Very carefully.
Why don't we wait on this night surveillance until we get the political talks? If you want to put the day flights on, just get them going. We can announce it later.
The proposal for Mr. Taunt, we should remember, calls for a standstill during the talks. The discontinuance of construction, discontinuance of shipping, discontinuance of the quarantine. After that, we'd negotiate a final settlement, which would relate to the withdrawal of the weapons.
I don't agree with that, Dean. I feel very strongly about this, Mr. President. And I think that the real crux of this matter is the fact that Khrushchev has got these pointed, for all you know, right at our hearts. The threat must be removed before we can drop the quarantine.
Well, now the quarantine itself won't remove the weapons. So we've only got 2 ways of removing the weapons. One is to negotiate them out. In other words, trade them out. Or the other is to go in and take them out.
This is the security of the United States. I believe the strategic situation has greatly changed with the presence of these weapons in Cuba.
I don't see how you can negotiate with these things sitting right on the launcher.
And the IRBM's becoming operational?
They've got to be made inoperable, or you're going back on our statement that we wouldn't negotiate under threat.
And all work must be stopped.
Then our position for the UN talks must be that the missiles are removed before we can discuss easing the blockade. I would think by tomorrow, Sunday, we would be in the position of deciding whether to expand the blockade or if we're deciding to go the other route, the force route. If we do invade, we have to face the fact that by the time we get to these sites after a very bloody fight, their missiles will be pointed at us. And we must further accept the possibility that when hostilities begin, those missiles will be fired.
Late that evening, Friday, October 26th. The 11th day of this crisis. The Oval Office.
The chiefs keep demanding we attack. I keep saying not yet, but...
How long do you think we can hold out before...
Before bombs start falling on Cuba? Thousands of people get killed. 3 days, maybe.
Excuse me, Mr. President. Mr. Bundy with an urgent matter.
Private channel message from Khrushchev. It's already several yards long. Part 4 arrived before Part 2.
Dear Mr. President, I have received your letter of October 25. From your letter, I got the feeling that you have some understanding of the situation which has developed and a sense of responsibility. I value this. I think you will understand me correctly if you are really concerned about the welfare of the world. Everyone needs peace, both capitalists, if they have not lost their reason, and still more communist people who know how to value not only their own lives, but more than anything, the lives of the peoples. We communists are against all wars between states in general and have been defending the cause of peace since we came into the world. We have always regarded war as a calamity and not as a game, nor as a means for the attainment of definite goals, nor all the more as a goal in itself. Our goals are clear.
And the means to attain them is labor. War is our enemy and a calamity for all the peoples.
Especially if you start one with your goddamn missiles.
I see, Mr. President, that you two are not devoid of a sense of anxiety for the fate of the world, understanding what war entails. What would war give you? You are threatening us with war. But you well know that the very least which you would receive in reply would be that you would experience the same consequences as those which you sent us. And that must be clear to us, people invested with authority, trust, and responsibility. We must not succumb to petty passions and intoxication.
Somebody's intoxicated.
If indeed war should break out, it would not be in our power to stop it, for such is the logic of war. I have participated in 2 wars and know that war ends when it has rolled through cities and villages everywhere, sowing death and destruction. Mr. President, do you really seriously think that Cuba can attack the United States and that even we, together with Cuba, can attack you from the territory of Cuba? Can you really think this way? How is it possible? We do not understand this. Has something so new appeared in military strategy that one can think it is possible to attack this way? I say precisely attack and not destroy, since barbarians, people who have lost their sense, destroy. I believe you have no basis to think this way. You can regard us with distrust. But in any case, you can be calm in this regard, that we are of sound mind and understand perfectly well that if we attack you, you will respond in the same way.
Bet your ass.
But you too will receive the same that you hurl against us. I think that you also understand this. My conversation with you in Vienna gives me the right to talk to you this way. You have now proclaimed piratical measures which were employed in the Middle Ages.
Piratical again.
Is it even a word?
Yeah, I looked it up the first time.
And you have called this a quarantine around Cuba. Our vessels apparently will soon enter the zone which your navy is patrolling. I assure you that these vessels, now bound for Cuba, are carrying the most innocent, peaceful cargoes. Do you really think that we only occupy ourselves with the carriage of so-called offensive weapons, atomic and hydrogen bombs? Although perhaps your military people imagine that these are some sort of special type of weapon, I assure you that they are the most ordinary, peaceful products.
He's delusional.
I don't know whether you can understand and believe me, but I should like to have you believe in yourself and to agree that one cannot give way to passions. It is necessary to control them. And in what direction are events now developing? If you stop the vessels, then as you yourself know, that would be piracy. If we started to do that with regard to your ships, then you would also be as indignant as we and the whole world now are. One cannot give another interpretation to such actions because one cannot legalize lawlessness. If this were permitted, then there would be no peace. There would be no peaceful coexistence. We should then be forced to put into effect the necessary measures of a defensive character to protect our interests in accordance with international law. Why should this be done? To what would all this lead?
He's been carrying on this argument in his head for days.
If people do not show wisdom, then in the final analysis they will come to a clash like blind moles, and then reciprocal extermination will begin.
That's actually quite poetic.
Let us therefore show statesmanlike wisdom. I propose we, for our part, will declare that our ships bound for Cuba will not carry any kind of armaments. You would declare that the United States will not invade Cuba. Then the necessity for the presence of our military specialists in Cuba would disappear. Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied, and a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. And then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly of what terrible forces our countries dispose. Consequently, if there is no intention to tighten that knot and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie the knot. We are ready for this.
He's asking you to give him a way out.
These thoughts are dictated by a sincere desire to relieve the situation, to remove the threat of war. Respectfully yours, signed N. Khrushchev.
I think the old man's losing his cool. And I don't particularly like the thought that the man with his finger on the nuclear button is losing his cool.
He's obviously under considerable strain.
He's defiant, but also pleading.
A cri de coeur.
But it doesn't beg a sensible response, because there's no sensible argument in there. It's incoherent.
I disagree.
The late-night ramblings of, as Dean said, a guy who's drunk.
That would be very Khrushchev.
Or unstable.
Well, I think it's clear what he's saying, which is, let's stop this. Help me stop this.
He doesn't say he'll remove the missiles. Nowhere in there does he say that.
It's vague, but it's there, as long as we promise not to invade.
Can I just say, I think he himself is in knots.
He senses war is fast becoming inevitable.
And he wants your help to prevent it.
Mr. Khrushchev is saying, maybe.
Saturday morning, October 27th, the Cabinet Room.
Mr. President, this just came over the news ticker. Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy yesterday he would withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba if the United States withdrew its rockets from Turkey.
Only he didn't.
Ted, which service is this from?
Reuters, but it's coming up on all of them now.
Khrushchev's letter didn't say anything about Turkey.
He may be putting out another letter.
Would someone check and be sure that what's coming in on the ticker is the letter that we were seeing last night?
We're going to be in an unsupportable position if this one becomes his proposal. In the first place, number one, we last year tried to get the missiles out of Turkey because they're not militarily useful. Number two, it's going to any man at the United Nations or any other rational man, it will look like a very fair trade. Have we gone to the Turkish government? I asked a week ago for that to be done.
Well, we've approached our ambassador to Turkey, Mr. Hare, to give us his judgment.
Have we had any conversations with the Turks?
We've not actually talked to the Turks, no.
Well, this is unsettling now because he's got us in a pretty good spot here. It's very difficult to explain why we are going to take military action in Cuba against these sites, what we're thinking about when he's saying, if you get yours out of Turkey, we'll get ours out of Cuba. I think you've got a very touchy point there.
I don't see why we picked that track when he's offered us the other track within the last 24 hours.
Well, he's offered us a new one.
I hear you, and I think the public one is serious when we have the private one.
Yes, I think we have to assume that this is their new and latest position, and it's public one. We have to now be thinking about what our position is going to be on this one, because this is the one that's before us and before the world.
Well, between the two, I think it's clear that practically everyone here would favor the private proposal.
Well, we're not being offered a choice, Ted. We may not be offered a choice.
Here, more copies of this morning's statement.
Well, it's clearly not the same letter of last night. This one explicitly demands a Cuba-Turkey swap.
How can we negotiate with somebody who changes his deal before we even get a chance to reply and publicly announces the deal before we even receive it?
My bet is that the long letter last night, he wrote himself.
And sent without clearance.
Exactly, Dean. And the Politburo wrote this one.
Well, I don't think what we can do is just put the ball completely in his hands and allow him to do whatever he wants. We need to respond.
I think it'll be very important to say at least that the current threat to peace is not in Turkey, it's in Cuba.
Until we find out what is really being suggested and what can really be discussed, we have got to get the work stopped. That's their weakness. The work's going on. But let's not kid ourselves. They've got a very good proposal, which is the reason they've made it public. Emotionally, people will think this is a rather even trade, and we should take advantage of it. Therefore, it makes it much harder for us to move against Cuba with world support. This is a pretty good play of his.
Mr. President, the Secretary of Defense is calling.
Put him through. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. President, there's been a significant change on the ground in Cuba. Our afternoon low-level surveillance flight pilots just reported that Cuban gunners tried to shoot them down.
Did we lose anyone?
No, sir.
These are the unarmed flights.
Yes, unarmed. The last few days, we've seen the Soviets taking control of the Cuban Air Defense Command. We have to consider that this was Soviet fire.
We're certain they're calling the shots.
Yes.
We need to put out a statement immediately. A Pentagon statement that says any interference with our surveillance will be met with counteraction.
Right away.
If we have to take action in Cuba, damn it. I wanted those Jupiters out of Turkey first. Now there's no time. Let's make sure we've got one of our Polaris subs within firing distance right away over there in case the Soviets try to take out the Jupiters with nuclear bombs.
Yes, sir. And, Mr. President, one more thing.
Yes.
The chiefs were just here pressing hard again for the airstrike on Cuba to commence tomorrow morning, or Monday at the latest, followed by the full invasion.
We're mobilized. I can give that order at any time.
Then we still have to call up the reserves. But they're shooting at our reconnaissance aircraft. We have to take out their SAM sites. The moment we take out their SAM sites and the MiG airfields, we're up to the 500 sortie program, and we must then be prepared to follow up with an invasion in about 7 days.
And we'll be fully ready for that. But what I think we need to do right away is answer these letters from Khrushchev.
Later that afternoon, Saturday, October 27th, the cabinet room.
Our emphasis must be on the fact that we want an indication from him in the next 24 hours that he's going to stand still and disarm these weapons. Then, under those conditions, we'll be glad to discuss Turkey and these other matters.
The NATO ambassadors to the UN met this afternoon in New York, and they took a very strong line against any discussion of this.
Well, of course they did, Dean. They haven't had the alternatives presented to them. They'll say, no, we don't want to trade the Jupiters off. They don't realize that in 2 or 3 days, we may have a military strike, which would bring perhaps the seizure of Berlin or a strike on Turkey. We all know how quickly everybody's courage goes when the blood starts to flow, and then that's what's going to happen to NATO. And then they'll say, my God, we should have taken the offer.
Mr. President, if we go ahead on the basis of a trade, we end up, it seems to me, with the Soviets still in Cuba, with planes and technicians, even though the missiles are out.
Yeah, but our technicians and planes and guarantees would still exist for Turkey. I'm just thinking about what we are going to have to do in a day or so, which is 500 sorties in 7 days and possibly an invasion, all because we wouldn't take missiles out of Turkey. Today sounds great to reject it, but it's not going to after we do something.
Excuse me, Mr. McNamara, a call from Colonel Wright.
Excuse me, gentlemen.
I wonder, Mr. President, whether we can't defer this route for 24 or 48 hours while we try the private letter route in answer to Mr. Khrushchev's letter of last night. There's always a chance that he will still accept that.
I don't think so, Ted. Not now that he's made this public offer.
But they may have been put out to pressure us to accept the first proposal.
The important thing for Khrushchev, it seems to me, is to be able to say, I saved Cuba, I stopped an invasion.
His position, even in this morning's public statement, is this was all started by our threat to Cuba. Now he can say he removed the threat.
He must be a little shaken up, or he wouldn't have sent last night's message in the first place. I agree. I don't think we should abandon it.
Mr. President, one of our U-2 planes has been shot down in Cuba.
Was the pilot killed?
His body is in the plane. Shot down over Baines, which is near a SAM site.
Well, now, this is very much an escalation by them, isn't it?
Yes.
How do we explain the effect of this Khrushchev message of last night and their decision now to fire at U.S. planes in view of their previous orders to do so only if attacked? That must be...
How do we interpret this? This is a change of pattern.
They feel they must respond now, but we need to maintain surveillance.
How can we send a U-2 fellow over there tomorrow unless we take out all the SAM sites? We can't have another guy killed.
This is exactly the problem. I don't think we can.
I think we ought to announce that an American plane was shot down. Surveillance plane in Cuba, and that action will be taken to protect our various aircraft.
We said we would 2 days ago.
Exactly. Then we ought to go in at dawn and take out that SAM site And we ought to send a surveillance aircraft in there tomorrow with the regular flights early in the morning. And we ought to be prepared to take out more SAM sites, take out the airfields.
All
and take out
24 SAM sites are believed to be now fully operational and capable of shooting down U-2 planes.
Let's wait 24 hours, and in the meantime, get this response out to Khrushchev, to his letter of last night. Bobby and Ted, you write it. We need to say you made an offer. We accept that. You've also made a second offer, which has to do with NATO, which we'll be glad to discuss at a later time. Run it by Ambassador Stevenson before you bring it to me.
Late that afternoon, Saturday, October 27th, the Truman balcony. A perfect autumn afternoon. Perfect as you could ask for.
Rudolph Anderson, Jr.
Who?
The pilot shot down this morning. Eagle Scout. Air Force Cross, Distinguished Service Medal. History repeats itself century after century. Politicians sit safely on their asses, spouting great principles, enjoying supper with the families, all while sending the bravest and the best off to die.
Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste death but once.
Lincoln?
Shakespeare. Julius Caesar. Somebody sent it to Mother after Joe died. I never forgot it.
Khrushchev doesn't want war with us any more than we want war with them, but we are very, very close to it. We may not be able to stop it. Have I done everything I could to prevent it?
I don't know what else you could have done. Jack, war is the easy choice.
Pay another call on Dobrynin. He's got to make Khrushchev see we are not fucking around.
Saturday evening, October 27th, the United States Justice Department, Office of the Attorney General.
Mr. Ambassador.
Robert.
Mr. Ambassador. We know that work on missile bases is being expedited. Our reconnaissance planes are being fired upon, and worse, one of our U-2 planes is being shot down and the pilot killed. Now, these men were flying unarmed planes. It's a very serious turn of events. And there's very little time for further deliberation. The president has to make certain decisions in the next 12 to 24 hours. He's done everything possible to avoid military engagement, but you forced our hand. Because of your deceptions and your lies.
This again.
If you had told the truth, we would need to be flying reconnaissance planes over Cuba. And if our planes are shot at, we have no choice but to shoot back. Do you understand?
Please do not speak to me in this pedantic manner. I am not a child.
And by forcing us to return fire, you will create an escalation of this crisis, the implications of which, as you well know, are very grave. Very grave indeed.
You cannot blame the Cubans for resenting the fact that the United States is violating their airspace.
If we had not violated their airspace, we would still be believing what Chairman Khrushchev had said, that there would be no long-range missiles placed in Cuba. In any case, it's far more serious than the airspace of Cuba. It involves the peoples of both our countries, people across the entire world. And we must have a commitment from the Soviet Union by tomorrow that those missile bases will be removed.
This is your ultimatum.
A statement of fact. If you don't remove those bases, we will.
An ultimatum.
And your country will probably feel it has to retaliate. But if you do, remember that before it's over, there will not only be dead Americans, but also dead Russians.
What is the United States making as an offer?
Dear Mr. Chairman, I have read your letter of October 26 with great care and welcome the statement of your desire to seek a prompt solution to the problem. The first thing that needs to be done, however, is for work to cease on offensive missile bases in Cuba, and for all weapon systems in Cuba capable of offensive use to be rendered inoperable under effective United Nations arrangements. Assuming this is done promptly, I have given my representatives in New York instructions that will permit them to work out this weekend, in cooperation with the Acting Secretary General and your representative, an arrangement for a permanent solution to the Cuban problem along the lines suggested in your letter of October 26th. You would agree to remove these weapon systems from Cuba under appropriate United Nations observation and supervision, and undertake, with suitable safeguards, to halt the further introduction of such weapon systems into Cuba. We, on our part, would agree, A, to remove promptly the quarantine measures now in effect, and B, to give assurances against an invasion of Cuba. The effects of such a settlement on easing world tensions would enable us to work toward a more general arrangement regarding other armaments, as proposed in your second letter, which you made public. I hope we can quickly agree along the lines in this letter and in your letter of October 26. Signed, John F. Kennedy,
No removal of your offensive missiles in Turkey.
The president's letter is clear. Resolve this, and we can discuss, quote, other armaments. There will be no quid pro quo. And if the Soviet Union claims that there is, we withdraw the offer. We're not removing missiles under threat.
The threat is offensive missiles in Turkey pointed at my country.
Which were installed publicly and openly, not in secret, and we never lied about them being there. In any event, they're junk. The president ordered them taken out some time ago. And once we get through this current crisis, we believe they'll be gone. But the Cuba situation cannot wait any longer. If we don't have a commitment from Mr. Khrushchev by tomorrow to withdraw those missiles from Cuba under UN supervision, there will be drastic consequences.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. You need to tell your chairman that. That night, the White House private living quarters.
Did you stop to eat anything? There's cold chicken on the sideboard. Pretty good.
Okay if I open this bottle of wine?
What's a Last Supper without wine?
It doesn't sound optimistic.
I just ordered 24 troop carrier squadrons of the Air Force Reserve to active duty for invasion. Not that I've abandoned hope, but if Khrushchev is serious about wanting to untie the knot of war, he only has a few hours. It's 8 a.m. in Moscow. My letter should be in his hands by now. His steel worker's hands. First time we met in Vienna, he gave me a bone crusher. Wanted me to know he was the stronger, the more powerful. That's what it's all about to them.
You should go to bed.
No, we've got to print a Roman holiday.
Audrey Hepburn.
Want to stay and watch?
I want to be with my family. Sunday morning, October 28th, the Washington Armory.
Bobby, where the hell are you?
The horse show at the Armory. I promised my daughters I'd bring them.
Well, I'm glad we got you. We just received word from the Russians. They're going to withdraw the weapons.
Gene, could you repeat that? It's a little noisy here.
Khrushchev took the offer. It's over.
A few hours later, the White House.
I just sent a letter to Khrushchev congratulating him on his statesmanlike decision. I also asked Pierre to ask the networks not to call this a victory for us.
Even though it is?
If Khrushchev thinks that's how we're playing this...
It'll piss him off.
And he could change his mind.
You won, Jack. This is a good day. A great day.
Lincoln said he didn't know if he controlled events or events controlled him. And maybe this is the night I should go to the theater.
If you go, I want to go with you.
I have to write this other letter now.
Which other letter?
To Major Anderson's mother.
The president didn't want us gloating or boasting. We won by giving Khrushchev a chance to avoid complete humiliation, and he didn't want anyone humiliating him now.
The missiles didn't come out right away. We added a condition that all those Soviet bombers had to come out, too. Khrushchev refused, and for the next 22 days we went back and forth, but eventually he gave in.
In the years since the Cuban Missile Crisis, I imagine many of us who were in the room every day felt that our contributions may have been...
overlooked.
Appropriated. In service of the Kennedy myth.
But ultimately, it all did come down to one man, didn't it? One very human being who had to make a decision. We didn't know until decades later just how incredibly close the world came to global nuclear war. It was at a conference in Havana 30 years after the crisis, attended by us and the Russians and the Cubans, of course, where their generals admitted that there had been 43,000 Soviet troops in Cuba in October 1962. 43,000.
The CIA estimate was 10,000.
And we also learned for the first time that all those Soviet missiles were indeed equipped with nuclear warheads. But what nearly knocked me to the floor was learning that the Russians on the ground had the authority to use those nukes if Moscow couldn't be reached. Now, assume for the minute that our forces had been directed to attack, they almost surely would have been confronted by nuclear fire. Imagine the headlines. Youthful American president sends American boys to be killed by Soviet nuclear weapons without equipping them to defend themselves.
The headlines on Vietnam were almost that damning.
Well, now we're talking about apples and oranges.
Are we, Bob?
Jack would tell you he wasn't a man of extraordinary intelligence.
But he had the wisdom to put a room full of intelligent men together whom he knew would have strong opposing opinions.
Which was I think the most critical of all the decisions he made during the crisis.
He listened. He considered. And he prevented nuclear war.
Jack, the children are asking for you.
Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.